Good morning. I am very excited to be here. This is my first in-person conference since the before times. And like many of you, I have been working over the last couple of years, like that young lady that Natalie showed us. I did not shave my legs either. But we reflect on the amazing possibilities that technology has opened to us to actually do our work remotely like this. It is truly incredible that we've been able to go through this experience and still be productive. This fourth industrial revolution that Natalie talked about has been spurred in great part through the appearance of computational technology. And computing has made many tasks faster, easier, cheaper. It's wrought all sorts of social transformations. And it has led to this explosion in the amount of information that we are dealing with and that we are producing every day, for both good and bad. And we've been hearing about all the good things that technology has. If you engage in conversation with anyone, you'll hear about the downsides of technology as well. And I am going to take a tack with this presentation to focus on the upsides of technology. I am going to argue that we are living through an historic inflection point in how we think, learn, and create. And I'm going to give you a glimpse of how you can use new technologies to become better thinkers, better workers, and hopefully better people. So I'm going to start with 3 observations about our current reality. The first is that this fourth industrial revolution has led to what my friend Carl Fast calls a new epistemic era. Like I said, all of us are dealing with more information and producing more information than any people have ever had to deal with before. Mark Andreessen said that software is eating the world. And as it does, more and more of what we do is transformed into information. And we have to deal with information to do our day-to-day work. And this has led to a bunch of changes. According to Gartner, in 2019, we surpassed 1 billion knowledge workers in the planet. That's a lot of people who do their work with information primarily. And this brings me to my second observation, which is that knowledge work is different than other types of work. If you were to somehow be able to interview a farmer from 200 years ago, they would have been doing work that was fairly similar to what their parents were doing. And they would have had to know the same things that their parents were doing. And those people, in turn, would have pretty much been doing the same thing that their parents were doing. And I'd be willing to bet that many of you have jobs that require different skills than what your grandparents needed to know. The things that I need to know today are very different from the things that I needed to know even at the beginning of my career. A lot of the technologies I was working with are now obsolete. So knowledge workers like us must be constantly learning. It's part of what we do. And that's one of the reasons why we've taken time out of our busy lives to be here. We come here to learn and to meet other learners, people like ourselves. It's part of what knowledge work entails. So we must not just think about the work, we must also think about how we think and how we learn. And that brings me to the third point, the third observation, and Natalie touched on this in her presentation as well, which is that contrary to what we've been taught, thinking doesn't happen exclusively in the brain. Instead, thinking happens in a complex set of interactions between your nervous system, your body, and the world, including things and other beings in the world. So consider this experience that we're having here, right? The words that you're hearing, you're not imagining them. They're coming out of my mouth. I am another being in the environment. And these words are being amplified through technology. And we are all sitting, well, you are sitting, I am standing, but we're all in this space that makes it possible for you to focus your attention on me and what I'm saying, and keeps us safe from the elements. Moreover, many of you are taking notes. I can see you. Some of you are using paper notebooks. Some of you are using tablets. Some of you are using computers, apps like Apple Notes or Evernote or Google Docs. These are things that you are thinking with. They're not just ways to remember what was said, although they do that. The very act of writing down what you're hearing changes how you process the information that you're receiving. These are tools that I call things for thinking, and they are more than just tools. They are extensions of your cognitive apparatus. And since you are all knowledge workers, it behooves you to think about this cognitive apparatus, these things that you think with, and look for ways to improve it. When I was a kid in school, I took notes in something called a trapper keeper. These are plastic binders that are divided into sections, and I would use these. I would have one section for each class that I was taking. And whenever I was in a class, I would take notes from what the teacher was saying, and when it came time to study for an exam, I would revisit those notes. And even though you could move pages around, the reality of this is that it was quite linear. Like, I could sit down at the end of the school year and start at the beginning and go to the end and revisit the entirety of what we learned. But I'll be honest with you, I never did that. I never revisited the past notes. I was always focused on the most recent one because that's the one that I was going to be tested on. And I'd be willing to bet that many of you are not going to revisit the notes that you are taking right now in this presentation. You think you might, but I don't think you will. Some of you may have used trapper keepers when you were in school. I think they're still sold. And I think that the notes that you are taking right now in your paper notebooks and in your apps are not very different from this. Many of the most popular note-taking apps in particular are structured very much like trapper keepers. These things stand in a long history of things for thinking. The earliest known writing from 5,000 years ago consisted of marks in clay tablets, and they were used to track food rations. You see, with the agricultural revolution came surplus, and surplus generated information. And these things allowed the people who were managing the food to keep track of all this information outside of their brains. It's a thing for thinking. Over time, the means we use to do this have become more convenient, easier, lighter, cheaper, right? So papyrus and vellum were important innovations. They were lighter than clay tablets and allowed you to revisit things, to make amends, to add things. Scrolls were a significant advancement. They allowed people to store longer information in a more compact way than clay tablets. But scrolls had a big problem in that they're strictly linear. So if you want to access information that's towards the end of the document, you have to unroll the whole thing. And people solved that problem with something called a codex, which has pages of something like vellum bound between two covers. You might recognize this, right? This is the ancestor of our modern books. And these were much more convenient than scrolls. So by the 6th century, they had all but replaced scrolls as our primary means of storing information. And Coley says the advantage they have over scrolls is that they allow for random access. So you can jump to any page. And this is useful, but it's useful in theory, because for these things to work, there has to be a consistent addressing scheme so that you can locate the information. And the first of these did not include an important innovation that came later, which we take for granted. They didn't have page numbers, and they didn't have indices. And you need those things if you want to be able to actually use it as a random access device. These things changed how we think, because all of a sudden you could address individual ideas, not just the book itself. You could reference these things in your own work. More innovations. Paper, then the printing press, right? This huge information explosion, the Gutenberg galaxy that we hear from McLuhan. Reading and learning proliferated. Scholarship, which was the province of a select few, became widespread. And people started doing things like annotating books and keeping notebooks and keeping these things called commonplace books where they would write down the things they were learning. Again, they were dealing, as we are, with this information explosion, and they're coming up with innovations to help them learn better during this time using the technology they have. And cheaper books brought other innovations, right? With cheaper books, suddenly books become less precious. So you can start doing things like cutting and pasting. You do this on your computers, right? Like these people are doing it literally. But you can only do that if you have 2 copies of the book, right? And that's afforded by cheaper books. You would not cut a handwritten book. This is Harrison's note closet from the 1640s. It's a piece of furniture meant to store notes. And the way that this worked is this allowed scholars to store slips of paper. I think you might be able to see them there. And on the other side, they had these commonplace headings, these categories. And these commonplace headings were a taxonomy that scholars used to organize their work. They're a predecessor of folders. You can think of them kind of like as folders. With the Industrial Revolution, organizations became a lot bigger. People had to manage a lot more people. People had to manage a lot more information. So more innovations in how people do this, right? This is the Wooten Patent Secretary, also known as the King of Desks. And this thing had 110 little cubbies where the user could stash little piles of paper where they kept their information. And I don't know if you can tell, but it can be closed and locked. So it was like a secure storage unit, right? But note that the little cubbies are horizontal. So literally, this is meant to stash paper in piles. So it was another important innovation that was not available to these people, which we take for granted again, the hanging folder file, right? So if you store paper vertically, it's easier to access it because you don't have to dig down through the pile to find what you're looking for. But that came later. Index cards. This came around the turn of the 20th century. An even more effective means of random access. They're smaller, they're hardier, so they can be reused more easily. And these lend themselves to capturing information more granularly than something like a scroll, right? Because they're small. So these things were used to build data stores for institutions like libraries, card catalogs, right? But they've also been used by individuals in their own work. So there's a German sociologist called Niklas Luhmann who, during his life, built up a catalog of 90,000 cards, which he used to produce over 70 books and 400 or so scholarly articles. And it's not just scholars, authors have used these since pretty much the beginning. So people like Vladimir Nabokov and Robert Greene and the author Ryan Holiday have used index cards to structure and write their books. Each one of these innovations changed how people think. You're much more likely to sketch ideas on a large whiteboard than you are on a clay tablet, right? And you're much more likely to reference an idea that you found in a book if the book has page numbers. And you're more likely to find the book if it's indexed in a card catalog in a library. So again, we think with things, and the structure of things changes how we think. So this brings us up to computers and the present day, which again, were a significant leap forward. And before I tell you what I think is new with computers, I want to emphasize 3 points about what I've been talking about. The first is that people have been thinking with things for a long time. We are not the first people dealing with this kind of situation, right? And the history of knowledge management is a history of our symbiotic relationship with technologies that augment our cognitive abilities. The evolution of how we manage information is a big part of the story of civilization. You can't manage complex societies like ours with clay tablets. The second point is that the structures of these technologies influences not just what we can do with them, but also how we think. A computer lets you do things like copy and paste blocks of text and undo, which something like a typewriter or a clay tablet does not afford. And that changes how you approach the thinking process. The third point is that we understand these new technologies through the lens of what has come before. And it can take a while for people to discover what makes a particular technology special and start using it in a way that exploits those capabilities. It took a while for people to figure out that these things needed page numbers. It took a while for people to figure out that hanging the paper vertically was more feasible than stashing it in piles. Early graphical operating systems mirrored real-world affordances. I heard someone snicker. Like, we laugh at this stuff today, right? But these things, when they came out, they were amazing. It was like, man, look at what I can do here. This is HyperCard, which was the first mainstream hypertext authoring application. And this thing used index cards as the central metaphor of the experience, right? And this is understandable. People in the mid-1980s were more familiar with card catalogs than they were with databases. So index cards here served as good training wheels, right? But hypertext can do so much more than index cards. Eventually, we leave the metaphors behind. Or do we? Because like I said, many of our current mainstream note-taking applications are still structured very much like trapper keepers. They have sections or folders where you're expected to archive these kind of long-form notes that try to capture everything about a subject. Computers can do better than this. They don't have to be beholden to the structure of analog technologies. And this is why I believe that we are at the cusp of a shift in how we think and learn. Because in the last few years, we've seen a slew of new applications in the market that I think are beginning to realize important parts of the vision that early computer pioneers, people like J.C.R. Licklider and Doug Engelbart and Ted Nelson, had for our relationship with these technologies. So what's different about these hypertext note-taking apps? Well, the first difference is that they make linking really easy. And particularly, they make linking notes with other notes in the system especially easy. Because many of the mainstream note-taking apps allow you to create links. But usually they're either tailored for external links or they're kind of cumbersome. And I'll show you what I mean by showing you how it's done using Apple Notes on the Mac, which is a pretty popular note-taking app. So in this case, I have two notes, one for the Memex and the other one for Vannevar Bush. And apologies for the people in the back, you might not be able to read this, but trust me, there's two notes in the system here. Note that they're all stashed in a little folder called demo, right, because of that structure thing. And what I want to do is I want to link Vannevar Bush's name on this note to Vannevar Bush's note over there. So this is the process on Apple Notes, okay? I have to jump to the second note, and then I click the Share Note button, which brings up this dialog box. Then I have to click on the Copy Link button. Then I am prompted to enter an email address when I do that. And it cannot be my own email address. Mind you, it has to be someone else's. And this puts the link to the note in the computer's clipboard. But I can't see that, right, because it's the clipboard. So then I have to navigate back to the original note. I select Bush's name. I click the Edit menu. I select that link. This brings up a dialog box. I paste the link. Voila. It's only something like 12 steps, right? So now let me show you how it's done with one of these new applications. This is in Obsidian, which is one that I use. And the thing I want to call out is that this is radically different, right? Like it's a radically different experience. It's achieving the same purpose, but a lot of the friction is removed. So many of these apps use a markup language called Markdown, which is plain text. And they allow you to do the linking inline. And if the page that you're linking to doesn't exist, it kind of creates it for you silently, actually. And these links are two-way, so that if I go to, if I'm in node A and I create a link to node B, and then I go to node B, I can see a list of all the incoming links to node A. To node B, sorry, including the link I just created from node A. And links aren't the only way to link to associate nodes. I can also transclude them, which means I can include the body of node B inside the body of node A and still have them be independent of each other. And because it's so easy to create relationships, nodes no longer have to include everything about a subject. So the system encourages you to create atomic nodes, nodes that capture one idea per node. And using these atomic nodes is akin to using index cards, right? It's the same difference between using an index card and a long scroll. All of a sudden, you are thinking in networks and not in these linear documents. So these systems also make it easy to tag and search your information. Like I said, the older systems encourage you to stash things into sections. With tags and such, you're creating longitudinal relationships rather than hierarchical relationships between nodes. They also provide really interesting ways to surface these relationships. So you can, for example, search for particular tags, but you can also view visualizations of your entire graph and see the clusters that are emerging in your system. The last point I want to emphasize is that many of these things are extensible by third parties, which is really cool because some of them, like Rome and Obsidian, are developing very vibrant third-party ecosystems that enable all sorts of interesting new functionality. And I'll give you an example of one that I use all the time. I read a lot on Kindle, and I like to highlight and annotate the books I'm reading. And I use a third-party service called Readwise, which syncs my Kindle annotations into my Obsidian repository, where it becomes part of the corpus, and I can reference using hyperlinks in the way that I've been describing. Again, many of these capabilities are not new. Like I said, some of the mainstream apps have some of these things, and more to the point, there have been systems in research labs that have been doing this for many years. What's different now is that these things are becoming mainstream. And these apps, these new apps, bring these capabilities together as a whole that results in much lower friction in thinking in this networked way. They also make it very easy, like I showed with the link. It's like I don't have to go hunting for the thing. I can create these associations on the fly. So in the old approach, the emphasis was on crafting individual notes, like the Trapper Keeper, right? Like I'm focused on the lecture or the thing that I'm hearing now, and maybe after a while, I will archive it, but for the most part, it's linear. Those of you using paper notebooks, if you are following the sequence of pages, by definition, the way that you're capturing is chronological, right? So it's quite linear. And as with the Trapper Keeper, like you're often focused on the most recent notes, right? The ones that happened weeks ago, months ago, years ago, kind of fade from memory. So your focus, your attention is oftentimes on the most recent stuff. In the new approach, the focus is not on individual notes, it's on the knowledge graph. That's the object of inquiry here, right? And these relationships allow you to create clusters that enable you to explore the information in different ways. There's a lot of emergent order, and there's a fantastic word that describes this, which I just learned about an hour ago or 30 minutes ago. It's called chaotic. You might have heard of it. It's a chaotic system, like what Natalie was describing, right? And these things are set up to encourage this kind of thinking. And again, I want to emphasize the focus is not on the individual note. The focus is on notes as part of this corpus that you're building. As a knowledge worker, I've made learning and teaching central to my work and my life. So I'm very excited about the new abilities that these systems enable. But I'm even more excited about where I see this stuff heading. Because I believe that many of the mainstream note-taking apps are going to start doing more of this because the technology is too powerful for them to ignore. I really think it changes how we think. But I'm also excited about it because I believe there's immense potential in combining these hypertext knowledge graphs with artificial intelligence. In the early modern era, scholars hired these people called amanuenses. These were secretaries that came and lived with them in their households, and they assisted them in their work. They would transcribe notes, they would summarize secondary works so the scholar didn't have to read them, they would index their notes, they would collate, they would do all of this stuff for them. I think that with atomic interrelated notes and artificial intelligence, each of us is going to have access to our own amanuenses. And this is going to change how we acquire knowledge, how we manage our knowledge through the course of our lives. A virtual amanuensis isn't a knowledge store. It's a tool to help us grow our knowledge over time. It's a collaborator. And this is not sci-fi. There are tools that do this. Again, apologies to the folks in the back. I'm using a tool called DevonThink, which is actually not a new tool. It's been around, but it integrates very nicely with these things. And what I'm using this for is I use it to index my Obsidian knowledge repository. And when I focus on a note, in this case I'm focused on the amanuensis note, it goes through my other notes and it spots patterns and it offers up suggestions as to which notes might be related. And what you have in the lower right here is a list of possibly related notes in my system. And some of these are uncanny, and I would not have thought of them. So I'd like to invite you to think differently about how you think with things. Yes, we're dealing with a lot of information, but we also have a lot of really, really powerful tools to help us manage it. So I don't want you to think of your knowledge management systems as containers where you store ideas. Rather than a filing cabinet or a trapper keeper, I'd like to propose a different metaphor, that of a garden. A garden isn't a static means of storage. It's something that you tend lovingly, patiently, over the course of a lifetime. There are different gardens because different people have different needs, and you will be building your own. But all of them are living things that take effort, but they produce nourishment and delight. And as knowledge workers in a new epistemic era, we must all be continually learning how to learn better. If you commit to learning by building a personal knowledge garden, it will produce fruit. But more importantly, it will give you the satisfaction of knowing that you invested your time here in a worthwhile pursuit, given your calling, your abilities, and the technologies available to amplify them. Thank you.